Good evening. I'm here at the chapel here live tonight over here in the Cross School campus, and I haven't been able a chance to talk to you in quite a while, and so I'm really excited about being here tonight, getting a chance to address to you and what's been close in my heart the last several weeks. Is you'll notice the title of this is These Things That Last Forever. And really, I had a different topic planned just a couple weeks ago, but as things began to evolve and as we moved into just a new world than what we were even 2 or 3 weeks ago, I decided to address something I think a little more will speak into where our felt needs are, where our hearts, where we find ourselves. Just even today, I know because I've been talking to a number of the seniors at May River and Bluffton High School whose high school graduation was officially canceled today. And so many things are changing so quickly that a lot of us are asking questions about what's next, where's God in all this, how do we live and move and have our being as Christians, how do we react to this, how do we see the best in this, and how would God have us live, how do we address this? And just yesterday it was told to me again, and often something I address, is that someone said to me, erroneously, meaning well, God will never give you more than you can handle. First of all, I've told many of you, that is not in the Bible. And secondly, that just ain't true. Many of us know very well that we have things all the time that are more than we can possibly handle. And right now, where we find ourselves right now, many people are in this situation right now. They're staring down the barrel of a shotgun, trying to figure out how they're going to pay their mortgage payment. Just last week, I've never had this happen in nearly 20 years of ministry. I had 4 people in 1 week call me and say that their marriages are teetering because they're being forced to deal with things that maybe when people could go to work and people weren't forced into situations and finances are a little more stable, but now they find themselves in a very different situation. And so my hope tonight is that what I'm talking to you about tonight will address at least a part of that and speak into our lives in a way that's been a comfort to me, how the gospel in many ways has repaired my life. And tonight, a passage is really one of the most famous passages in the Bible. It comes out of the 13th chapter in the book of 1 Corinthians. It's one of the most well-known passages in the Bible, the passage that's primarily known as the love chapter. And if you've ever been to any weddings, it's really read at almost every wedding. But I want to talk tonight particularly about 2 verses, and verses 12 and 13. I wanted to play this to you. I recorded this earlier, me reading this, because I knew I could read it a little more confidently. So I want you to watch and to listen to this.
Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. But then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. 3 things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love.
Now I want to highlight that part where it says, now we see things imperfectly. Because what this is saying, what Paul is suggesting here, and not just suggesting, he's really saying is reality, is that, and this is absolutely true, we find ourselves right now, we see things imperfectly. We don't see things clearly. The Bible would suggest here that we see shadows, we hear whispers. I love how the King James Version says it, and I want to put it up here. It says, we see through a glass darkly. In other words, if you look through brown glass, you can still see what's on the other side of it, but you can't see it with perfect clarity. There's a blurriness to it. You can make it out, but you don't know exactly what it looks like. This is exactly where we find ourselves right now, where we find ourselves in our society moving forward into the future, not just here locally, but around our nation, but even globally. And it brings me back to this passage that you just heard, where it says here, now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. But one day, God says, we will see God face to face. And this is the part that I think that has so captured me. And I want to highlight this part where it says, all that I know now, All that you and I know now, all that we know now is partial and incomplete. But in the future, there is a time where you and I will know everything in a perfect way, which is how God now sees us. God now sees us perfectly. One day we will see ourselves like that, and we will see God like that. There is a day where it will come like that. But right now, what we see now is partial and incomplete. There are all kind of things that God arranges, that God allows, that connect with one another that very often we cannot see. And the reason when we cannot see is because we are lower than where God is. God is above it all, and God sees all and controls all and is over all. And because he sees those things, he knows exactly what's going to happen. He's working all things together for good for those who love God, who live according to his will and to his purpose. And therefore, this is exactly what this message is about tonight, speaking into that he is working all those things together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. I've often mentioned this. It's worth saying again, but I've often said that, my dyslexia has been something that God, years ago, I could not figure out why God would allow that to happen. It was such a struggle for me. And even when I worked my tail off, I just couldn't seem to get ahead of people. Now, one of the great things about it, and it's taken me 25, 30 years later to realize God used those very things to make me the person who I am today. There is just no way that I could be nearly as effective pastor if I had not gone through those things. I never want to go through them again, okay? But I can look back and be thankful for once being sad, because this made me greater now than if I'd never gone through that sadness. This is what this is speaking into. And I've only gotten that through not just seeing it from a higher perspective, but having some life and going through life longer to be able to look back and see that. And what I'm saying to you is, and I think what this passage is saying here is, unless you and I can see through the sands of time, we just cannot say that God is not working, that God is not moving, that God's will is not in our lives in every possible way. And so what this means here is there will be many times where we will not understand. It will not make sense. And yet God is still moving. And I think you're going to see that here in this passage tonight, what this is saying here. Because what it suggests here is, and again, I don't know if it's even suggestion. I think this is just a reality that God is speaking into. There are three things. All these other things will pass away, but there are three things that will literally last forever. What are those things? Let me put them up here. These three things are faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these, Paul says, is love. But what Paul is saying here, what the Bible is saying here, there are three things that will literally last forever. They will never end. Faith, hope, and love. And this is a common theme throughout the Scriptures. It's a common theme in Paul's theology. It's a common theme in the Gospels. I'll put a few passages up here where it says about this in Romans 5. Because of faith and this hope, and with hearts full of love. Okay, there it is. Faith, hope, and love. Again, this common theme. It says it there in Colossians chapter 1. For we have heard of your faith, Paul says. And it talks about the love that God has put in us. And because of that, we have a confident hope. Faith, hope, and love. The same thing. It's also said in 1 Thessalonians, okay, we think of your faithful work, Paul says, loving deeds and the enduring hope that you have because of our Lord Jesus Christ. The same common theme, faith, hope, and love. These are the three things, Paul said, that will literally last forever. So it's about sowing our life in such a way that we are living into those three things, about having faith, about possessing hope, and about having a love that transcends time and space, and even, we'll see in a minute, death itself. And so let me just walk through these about faith, hope, and love. Let me deal with the first one up here, and that is the whole idea of faith. We know that Jesus Christ says that if you have the faith of a mustard seed, which at that time, at that known part of the world, that was at that time known as the smallest seed possible. Now, there were other smaller seeds, but Jesus wouldn't have talked about other seeds that no one knew anything about. But he mentions the smallest seed that people would have known, and that is the mustard seed. And what he said is, if you have the faith that's the size of this little tiny, I mean, it's like a little dot. Have you ever seen these mustard seeds? Then he said you can move mountains. You can accomplish anything. Which brings me to a really, really important point that I've talked to people about faith over the years. And very often when I've talked to people about this, a little light has come on for them, as it did for me many years ago, because many people think faith is about having this great size faith. Or they'll say to me, "Oh, Jonathan, you have really great faith, and I don't have a whole lot of faith. My faith's really small." And what I've often said is, it's not to say that great faith doesn't matter. But in the grand scheme of things, it really does not matter. The Bible would say it doesn't really matter the size of your faith. It matters where you place your faith, where you direct your faith, where you put your faith into. And let me see if I can illustrate this in a way that at least then I can understand this, and I hope I can communicate this with you, something that I have mentioned before. I want you to imagine here that, let me put this up here. The object of our faith is more important than the size of it, as I was mentioning that. But I want you to imagine here, there were three people, three men, and they are in a snow-covered forest. And they are running in the snow-covered forest all individually, and they're all running from this sucker, okay? They're running from this huge bear. And they're trying to get away because they know if this bear catches them, they're on the road to glory, okay? So they're trying to get away from this bear, and each of them individually come to this frozen lake. And they all come into it individually. And the first man comes to the lake, and he's sitting there thinking, I don't know if this lake's going to hold. I don't know if this ice is going to hold. He is jumping down in the lake saying, there's no way it's going to hold. I'm going to crash to the ice. I'm going to drown, and I'm going to drown here underneath the ice here. But he feels like he doesn't have another option, so he jumps on the ice. It's strong enough, and he gets away. He gets away from the bear. The second man comes up to the ice, and he's sitting there thinking, it's 50-50, this ice is going to hold. I mean, I don't know if this is going to hold, but he thinks it's pretty cold, so he jumps on the ice. He gets away. The third man comes up to the ice, and he sits and says, you know what? We are in northern Minnesota. I grew up here. I know how cold it is. This ice is at least 18 inches thick. You could drive an 18-wheeler on top of this ice. He doesn't really even think about it. He immediately jumps on the ice, and he gets away. Now, I've talked about this over the years with people, and here's the question I've asked people. I've asked people, okay, out of the three men, okay, which one had the greatest faith? Now, there's usually a debate, especially people with philosophical backgrounds, say, well, the first guy had great faith because he didn't think there was going to hold, and he jumped anyway. And people say, no, the third guy had the most faith because he absolutely believed it was going to hold him. And what I've said is, it doesn't, guys, listen, people, the size of the faith does not matter. It's what they put their faith into. And that is, the first guy comes up and said, he's jumped on this, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. He didn't. He jumped. He was saved. The third guy came up and jumped immediately. And here's the question I think is a better question to ask. Okay, which one of the people were more saved? And you say, well, they were all saved. And that's exactly the point, because it wasn't the size of their faith that saved them. It was the object they put their faith into, and that was the ice. And so how much faith did it take for them to be saved? Okay, just enough to jump. How much faith does it take to believe in God and to follow after God? Just enough to come. Just enough to follow. And this is the story of the Gospels. The people over and over and over again who come to Jesus many times with little faith, believing that he could do something about their lives. He could address their sadness. He could address their misery. They could come to him, and he knew that he could do something about it. That's the faith that the Bible's talking about here. Not the size of it, but the direction we put it in. And that is, putting our faith in Christ makes all the difference. And so tonight I'm saying here, the real lesson here is, how much faith does it take here? What the Bible's talking about is just enough to come, just enough to believe, just enough to say, Jesus, I'm going to follow in your footsteps, even if I do not completely understand. Just like the first guy that came to the ice, just enough to jump. So again, it's about faith. The second thing Paul says here, though, I think is just as important, is the whole idea of hope. And that is, it, to me, and I think this is something that is spoke in my life as much as anything over this last month. And I think this is especially true right now when we find ourselves, is that I've had to, the last several weeks, is to recalibrate how I see things going into the future versus what maybe how I saw it in the past. And that is to ask myself, what is it that really matters? What is urgent, what matters, and what really counts? Because what I know is, as a minister, as a husband, as a pastor, just as a human being, that we are hope-based creatures, that we are very much controlled by what we think will happen in the future. Meaning, if we think things are going to get better and we think there is a greater light in the future, we can endure almost anything. But if we do not think it's going to get better, if we think there is no light at the end of the tunnel, it can directly impact our present circumstances. And we need a hope to keep us alive, to get us through, I would just say, even me as a minister, just the everyday sadness that I see. Just the injustices that we experience and we see throughout our society, throughout the world. Just the suffering of people. Just the sadness of that. And it reminds me of a very well-known passage out of Psalm 30 where it says, and I'll put it up here, weeping may last through the night, but joy comes in the morning. And what this has taught me is you don't need to read this verse. You don't need to know this exists in the Bible to know that you can look all around you and see the sadness that you and I are watching, that maybe many of you are watching tonight are actually experiencing. We don't need to turn on the TV and to know that there are a lot of people suffering right now. There are a lot of people that are distraught. There are a lot of people that are experiencing, they are going to bed at night crying themselves to sleep. We know there are people that are weeping in New York. We know there are people that are weeping in Italy. We know there are people that are weeping globally. That what we are experiencing just in our little community here in Bluffton and beyond that is happening around the United States, is happening around the world. And many people are asking the question, and I know this just for a fact because I have had more pastoral crisis in the last month, and I think I almost would say in a year, talking to people, that people are asking the question and they're wondering, what does my future hold? And I know what they're asking that on the other end of that question is because I think there's a sense I almost can sense despair in that because they don't know what the future holds. What we know and what we can't see right now, what I want to tell you tonight is there is something that's coming that is greater than what we can see right now. Because if you look at the second part of this verse here, okay, it says, okay, but joy comes in the morning, which seems to say here that although we are weeping now, there is a time when joy is going to happen. In other words, it is never so bad to know that it's not going to get better. And I may have mentioned this a few times ago. I can't remember if it was here or on the other campus. But I don't know when it was, but I watched a documentary on Netflix. And it was an odd documentary, but someone had sent it to me and said, this might be something that's pastoral for you. But it was on people who had survived suicide. And people who had either jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived, or survived, an overdose or whatever, who basically were trying to take their lives out of despair. They were in a deep, deep depression. And what was interesting about them is the interviewer asked all of them, they said, what do you know now that you did not know then? And they said, well, back then, before that, I did not think it was going to get any better. I was so convinced that my life was never going to get better. I saw no light in the tunnel. I was not getting any victories, and I just did not think I could go on. And they say, what we now know is it did get better. And what I had to learn is I just had to get through those tough times. And it may have taken years, but I now know they all said that because they survived, they realized it did get better. And that's exactly what this is saying here. Okay? Weeping may last through the night, but joy comes in the morning. And what I'm saying to you is God is still working. And there are all kind of things connected that we cannot see and understand. And God is high enough above it to see that everything is going to work itself out for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. You know, as I was mentioning today on social media, this morning, 8 years ago this morning, I preached my first sermon here over at Cross School over here at the Buckwalter campus. And one of the things I was remembering is when I first got here, for the first year or two, when I didn't really know my way around town except for the larger roads, someone, maybe year 3, sent me a map or a GPS kind of picture that was sat over, it was 3 or 4 pictures that sat over Bluffton. And suddenly I realized I could see all the roads, and I suddenly realized there were all these roads that connected these other roads, these main roads that I never knew even existed. And I said, oh my gosh, if I take that road, I can cut half my time off over here. Now, the problem is I couldn't see that because I was in ground level, but once I saw high enough, I could see how they all interconnected and how they were so much easier. That is very much true how we see our lives. Everything we see now is ground level, is incomplete, is partial. We see through a glass darkly. But from God's level, he sees it all and how all of them seem to interconnect. And what we may see now is a curse. I think we're going to see years later, and certainly going through into eternity, is going to be an incredible blessing. We've just got to get through it and ask God to give us enough faith, okay, just to follow him, just to come, and enough hope to realize weeping is at nighttime, but joy comes in the morning. And so because of that, just realize we are where we are, and God is where he is, and he sees all, and he is over all and in all. And he sees how it happened and why it happened, how the two interconnect with one another, and how it all fits together. And I've said before, and this came from my mentor, my seminary professor, my mentor, who said years ago, I've never forgotten this, he said, he was absolutely convinced of this. It doesn't say this in the Bible, but he said the Bible would certainly suggest this, that the first word out of our mouth when we get to the city of God and we see God and we see all, and suddenly we have all this knowledge where nothing is no longer impartial and incomplete. We don't see it in shadows. We are fully known as God now knows us fully. He said the first word out of our mouth is going to be, oh. 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 Okay. That's why you allowed that to happen. Okay. All right. That's why you allowed that to take place. That's why you allowed me to go through that season. That's why you allowed this person to be taken. Oh. Because see, we're going to see it all then. And suddenly it's going to make sense. That is absolutely true. And what I know now is, and let me just take this a step further than this, that I think it's the greatest story of the Bible that talks about hope. And that is, we are going to find ourselves, whether it's this season or in seasons to come. And I'm absolutely sure that we have been asking ourselves the question the last several weeks, or a series of questions, and I'll put them up here. And that is these questions here: why is God allowing this to happen? Okay, this makes absolutely no sense. If God cares, okay, why didn't he do something about it? What good could possibly come out of this? Or we're looking at a certain situation and we say there is no hope. We have asked these questions, and whether we've asked them, we have certainly thought these questions. And there are doubts that come in our mind, and we're asking these questions. And here's what I want to suggest to you. Now, I've said this before, but I want to remind you about this. When Jesus Christ was hanging on the cross, the only people that were left around him, just a handful of people, all they knew is they were looking up at the cross, and all they knew was, here is the greatest person they'd ever known. And I think to a large degree, they knew that he was greater than just some prophet. They knew he was God himself. And they knew his greatness. They saw him feed thousands. They saw him heal people. They saw him bring people from absolute despair. They saw him resurrect people. They saw him resurrect lives. And all they knew was they were watching this man they loved so deeply. He had done so many great things. All they knew is they were watching him being tortured to death. And they could not understand why. And do you know the questions they were asking when they were looking up at the cross? Okay, they were looking at the cross and they were asking the same questions you and I ask. Okay, and that is, why is God allowing this to happen? Okay, this makes absolutely no sense. If God cares, okay, why didn't he do something about it? Or what good could possibly come out of this? Or saying, looking as they watched him die, being tortured to death, they were saying, there's absolutely no hope. They were asking the same questions that you and I ask. And the amazing thing is, looking back now, was God was allowing this to happen for his purposes. As I've said often, the greatest act of love and the greatest act of redemption in the history of the world. But nobody understood. Nobody saw that. All they saw was death. All they saw was sadness. All they saw was suffering. And many of them, I think I probably would have been one of them, they left Golgotha that day, going home to their homes, bitterly disappointed that God could allow something like this to happen. And yet what God was allowing to happen was something that was so, it was the greatest game changer in history for his purposes. And what I want to suggest to you is, very often, we are somewhere between Good Friday and Easter morning. Okay, there is weeping in the night on Good Friday. But see, there's a joy that's coming for us. It's not something that is going to happen. It will happen, which means it is going to happen. There is resurrection. This is happening for us. This is waiting for us. So our future directly impacts our present circumstances. It directly impacts how we live our lives, how we live and move and have our being. So what we believe our future to be will directly influence how we live right now. And the story that I share, my life are just full of stories. I remember when I was in seminary, one of my very, very good friends, he drove remember those old mail trucks, those little tiny Jeeps? He drove an old mail truck, him and his wife did, and it was like, I think it had something like 500,000 miles on it. And it didn't even have doors on it. It was the biggest piece of junk I've ever seen in my life. And we used to laugh about it. And we were all in seminary. We were trying to figure out how to pay for seminary, try to get out of there without debt. And he was so relaxed. He was never worried about money, even though he didn't have any. And we were always amazed about his faith about that. And I remember one time a group of us were talking to his wife and about this very thing. And she said, looked really surprised, and she said, you mean he never told you? And we said, tell us what? What are you talking about? He said, she goes, I cannot believe he hasn't told you this. About 16 years ago, his mother died when he was very young. His father got terminal cancer, and his father died when he was in college. But his father was something like $20 million. He left it all in trust for him to get at the age of 30. And we suddenly realized why he was so relaxed. Because we're all worried about money. He was never worried about it because he knew what was in the future for him. He knew what was there was going to be waiting for him, and he didn't have to worry about a thing when it comes to finances. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of things that happen in our lives, but you understand what I'm saying here. His future directly impacted his present circumstances, and this is exactly what I'm saying to you here. If you read history, you will find the Christians who did the most in this present world were the ones who thought the most of the next. They knew what their future held, and it directly impacted how they lived their lives presently. And those that are losing, I'm saying this tonight to you, those that are losing hope or have lost hope, and you don't believe it's going to get better, this says otherwise. We have an absolute hope that is changing us. And so again, we have faith and we have hope, and that directly impacts how we move into our future. And let's bring this last part, and this the whole idea of love. The Bible tells us that we are made in the image of God, which means we have the ability to some level to mirror and to reflect a part of God, to reflect his care, to reflect his compassion, to reflect his joy, and most of all, I think, to reflect his love. Because God made us in his image, and because we are bound to one another. What's amazing to me in the book of Genesis, before the fall, before sin entered into the world, there was one ache that mankind had that was not the result of sin, and that was the ache of fellowship, the ache of relationship, the ache to want to be with people. So it's something that God kind of hardwired in us, that we long to be with one another. We long to love and to be loved. And because sin has entered into the world, it has been marred, it's been wounded, it's been desecrated, and yet we still feel it. And I would say we feel the most alive when we are loved and we love others. And what any of us know is that love can not just be perceived, but it is a knowable force. It rights the biggest wrongs. It heals the deepest wounds. Love is the one thing that seems to transcend time and space, and I would even suggest death itself. It's the one thing that matters above anything else. It's the one thing that will cause us to fly around the world. It was the one thing to give up all our money. We'll give anything to have it, to communicate it, to feel it. And when we're able to love and to be loved, I would say to you, this is when we feel the most alive. And let me just speak into this, because when this is all over and we get through the other side of COVID-19, what I want to say to you and speak to all of God's people that may be watching this or listening to this, let the actions that we take now, let the decisions we make today and tomorrow and this week be the stories that are worth telling weeks and months and years from now. Okay? Our believed in future directly impacts our present circumstances. So I want us to think here eternally and cosmically. The greatest love that you and I ever need to survive, we think, is not actually here on earth. It's actually waiting for us in the city of God. That is where it is perfect. It's not partial. It's not incomplete. It's not seen through a glass darkly. We are, as it says there in that passage, we are fully known, just as we will know God fully. The greatest love that you and I need is actually waiting for us. And let me see if I want to give this illustration. Jonathan Edwards, who I think is one of the greatest theologians in American history, one of the greatest preachers in American history, he preached a sermon nearly 300 years ago called Heaven in a World of Love. And he talked about the passage out of Luke 16, where Jesus, it's the parable of the unjust steward. And I don't need to go into all the details about that, but what's important to me is Jesus basically cracks open the door and has us look inside the city of God, into heaven itself, and to see what it looks like. And what you begin to discover, it's full of people. It's full of love. And what Jesus is saying here is heaven is a place of friendships. Heaven is a place of love, because ultimately, this is what we're after here. And look what he says here. I want to put this passage up here. He says, I've gotten ahead of myself. Okay. This is a movie that I've talked about before that is one of my favorite. It may be my favorite movie of all time. If you have not seen Interstellar, you have got to see it. Okay, I have watched it probably 50 times. My children have watched it. Many people have watched it. But what is amazing about the movie itself is you watch these high-rated scientists, these astronauts, who are basically trying to save the world. It's about 30 or 40 years into the future. They're trying to save us from human extinction. And they're scientists. They're evolutionary biologists. And one of the biologists is talking to the other. You'll see, you'll notice the actors in here. One is saying here, she's trying to look past science and saying the one thing that seems to capture us, that science cannot explain, is the whole idea of love. That you cannot just say it's molecules in your brain that are making this happen. She's saying it's something greater. And I want you to watch this scene because I think this captures what I'm getting at here. Watch this.
But maybe we've spent too long trying to figure all this out with theory.
You're a scientist, Bran.
So listen to me. When I say that love isn't something we invented, it's observable, powerful. It has to mean something.
Love has meaning. Yes, social utility, social bonding, child rearing.
We love people who have died. Where's the social utility in that?
None.
Maybe it means something more, something we can't yet understand. Maybe it's some evidence, some artifact of a higher dimension that we can't consciously perceive. I'm drawn across the universe to someone I haven't seen in a decade, who I know is probably dead. Love is the one thing we're capable of perceiving that transcends dimensions of time and space. Maybe we should trust that, even if we can't understand it yet.
It's brilliant. Okay, the scriptures teach us this. Your love, the love I'm talking about here, it must be real. Hate what is evil, do only what is good, love each other. Love each other in a way that makes you feel close like brothers and sisters. See, what the Bible is saying here is, and what I'm saying to you is, family is not just our blood, but those who can become our blood. And those who are drawn to the same Father. And if Jesus Christ and God the Father is our Father, it stands to reason that our family is greater than the ones that are they're just our blood. It moves past that. And what this is saying here is what unites us to one another through our Father's love for us is the love we have for one another. And what I want to suggest to you tonight here is building the kingdom or going into the future. It's not just about ourselves, but it's about a wider net going out to reach into those lives who move near our own. Those are the things that will literally last forever. Because what I'm talking about here, a people or the love that the Bible's talking about here, these are the things that will literally last forever. They never can be taken away from us. And one of the highest callings of us as Christians, it may be the highest calling, is the relationships and the lives that move into our own, in the impact that we can have on those lives. And so in that passage there in Luke 16, where I was mentioning earlier, Jesus says this, let me suggest this, I'm getting ahead of myself again. In Romans 12, it says, look for people who need help and welcome them to your homes. Now, this is thinking about just our present circumstances you and I are living in here. But Jesus Christ takes it a step even further when he talks about moving past just what we live in our lives right now and moving to something where we're going to be 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 500 years from now. And he says this, use worldly resources to gain for yourselves friends, and when it is gone, you will be welcomed to eternal dwelling places. Now, let me just say a couple things. Is this saying here about buying friendships? No. This is talking about investing our lives in such a way that we invest our lives in people in a way that somehow they will capture what has electrified our lives, what has changed our hearts, what has drawn us to God, the faith we have and the hope we have and the love we have for God. They will see that and they will capture that. And because of that, and we invest our lives in them in such a way that whether they get there before we will, that when they get there, and maybe one time we get there later, they will welcome us into their eternal dwelling places because of how we invested our lives in them. It's talking about a friendship that will literally last forever. It's talking about creating a fellowship of friends and family that will survive and look beyond death. And therefore, as a Christian, there is never a goodbye. For the Christian, there is always, 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 I will see you tomorrow. We never say goodbye. And love is the central driving force of all of it. And we saw this in the movie clip, okay? why, and she even brought this up, why do we continue to love people 30 and 40 and 50 years after they've died? Okay? It does nothing for evolutionary biology. It doesn't help us at all. In fact, it hampers health. It's because we know there's something greater. And I have often said this many times. Many of you know my love for C.S. Lewis. I preach it at almost every funeral, but I want to get a little philosophical here, and I want to close with this idea. And that is, where does the idea come from? And why do we feel like when someone dies, we have been cheated? Why do we feel like we have been robbed? Because people say, scientists will say, that death is just natural. And yet there's not a person watching this or listening to this that does not know that it feels completely unnatural. It feels like someone has been taken from us. And what Lewis argued is that natural theology, rational thought teaches us this. When you look around nature, it teaches us this, that creatures are not born with desires unless there's a way to satisfy those desires. So, for example, he says, ducks are born wanting to swim in water. There's a such thing as water. Babies are born desiring milk. There's a such thing as milk. Human beings have a thirst to learn. There's a such thing as knowledge. Human beings feel a desire for sex. There's a such thing as sex. And what Lewis says is, if 100% humanity, regardless of whether they believe or not, has a desire to live forever, has a desire to be reunited with those we love, and nothing in this present life can satisfy that desire that we all have, he says the most probable explanation is that you and I were built for another world. We're built for a place that transcends time and space and even death itself. And Jesus Christ is the one central figure in history who's come along and said, I can do something about it. I have done something about it. It's because of my birth and my suffering and my death and ultimately my resurrection that I can lead you to the place you have longed for your entire life if you believe in me through just a mustard seed of faith and the great hope that I will give you and the love that I have for you. And this is the reason why Jesus says, in John chapter 14, he goes, in my Father's house there are many rooms, And he says here, and I want you to know that I'm going there to prepare a place just for you. And one day, I'm going to come back, whether it's tonight or 50 years from tonight, I'm going to come back and I'm going to take you to the place you have longed for, you've desired your entire life. And Thomas said to him, Jesus, what are you talking about? How do we know the way? And he said, Thomas, you know the way. You've always known the way. You've just forgotten. I am the way and the truth and the life. And I will take you to this place you've longed for your entire life. And when you think about this, what this sums up in the end is faith, hope, and love. The three things that will literally last forever. Listen to this.
Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror. But then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete. But then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely. Three things will last forever: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love.